Good evening. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove and welcome to our next step on the journey we're taking through St. Mark's Passion narrative. And we're getting close to the end now. Now, we've just come across these women who are on Calvary watching from a distance. And if you like, I said that the camera was on Jesus, and now the camera goes to the audience for a reaction shot, as it's sometimes called in television circles. So the women, we've had the first reaction shot from the centurion who sees how Jesus dies. Now we look at the women. What we're told is that they were watching. To watch is a very important verb in the Bible and in the gospel. Jesus tells his disciples many a time, stay awake. Watch means stay awake as well. It doesn't just mean look, it means stay awake, be alert, be on the ready. So they are watching. They haven't gone to sleep, unlike the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. They have watched with our Lord. They have watched with him, kept vigil with him, while he is suffering for the sins of the world. So that's the first lesson. We are called to watch. We are called to stand ready. We are called to be there with our Lord, in communion with our Lord. I think that is the most important thing. We're supposed to stand up and be counted as part of his community, as these women are doing, albeit from a distance. Sometimes we can do that from a distance. And of course, the distance between us and Jesus, the distance between the women and Jesus was 100 yards. The distance between us and Jesus is 2,000 years. But despite that distance, we belong to Christ. This is very important. I cannot stress that point enough. By reading St. Mark's Gospel, you are joined to Christ. You become one of his people, just as these women who lived before the Gospel was written. They become his people. We enjoy the same relationship with Jesus as they do, thanks to our reading of the book. Then he goes on to say who these women are. And we have Mary of Magdala. Right, okay, we know about her. Well, no, we don't, actually. We've been misled about her. She was never a prostitute. Sorry to disappoint you. This wonderful story we have of the repentant prostitute is a much later pious invention. Mary of Magdala was a woman who came from Magdala, which is a town on the shores of the lake, which was famous for, funnily enough, its fish sauce, which was exported all over the Roman Empire. It's quite possible, because Mary of Magdala followed our Lord, that she was a person of independent means. And in fact, it says, these used to follow him and look after him when he was in Galilee. In other words, they looked after him not just by doing his ironing and things like that, but by supporting him financially, is the implication. Mary of Magdala was probably a rich businesswoman from the town of Magdala. Independently financially independent, she was probably a widow. Or maybe she had left her husband at home and gone off to follow Jesus, which might have been quite scandalous. That might be the seed of the story, that she was a repentant prostitute. Certainly, she has adopted a rather revolutionary pose for a woman of her time. So the idea that you get, for example, that women were not important in those days is actually a little bit misleading. Later on in the Acts of the Apostles, we have that lady who was the businesswoman who traded in purple dye, who also was a great supporter of St. Paul. St. Paul had lots of very important women around him who were his supporters and his financial supporters, his backers, if you like. So she's a major backer of our Lord. And of course, she also has an important role to play in the future, because she is the one our Lord will send to his disciples, in St. John's Gospel at least, telling them he's risen from the dead. And we can assume that after the resurrection, she didn't just tell the disciples and then keep quiet about it. She kept on telling people about it. In other words, she was an evangelist. She was one who spread the gospel. She worked for Jesus when Jesus was on earth, and she worked for Jesus after the ascension into heaven of Jesus. So she was one of the pillars of the early church, as are the other two. One is the mother of James the Less, and the other is Salome, who is the mother of James and John. We know that Salome was quite an important woman. She was certainly pushy, because she's the one who came up and says, look, I want a place for my boys, one at either side of you when you come into your kingdom. She was probably a high status woman from various clues we have about St. James and St. John in the Gospels. Remember that James and John were called to leave Jesus. They left their father with the men he employed. In other words, by the standards of the day, James and John were part of a big business, a family business, but nevertheless quite a prosperous business. And this Salome, who's also a follower of our Lord, she too is a woman of, I don't want to sound like, a very famous novelist, a woman of substance. And so, therefore, these people were rather important people, and they would have been major players in the early church, as indeed were James, and as indeed were John. Now, we know less about James the Less and James the Younger and Joseph. We know that they're probably relations of our Lord. And the other Mary, who is their mother, is also a relation of our Lord, one of our Lord's aunts, or the cousin of the Virgin Mary, and so on and so forth. So we have two Marys and Salome standing there. And they are people who are going to propagate the Christian message. They are members of the church. How important it is for us to be members of the church. And where did the church start? It started on Mount Calvary, a very stony ground, but one, and a very bare, ugly tree, the cross, but one which was destined to be fertile ground and indeed to be a tree that bore abundant fruit. Right now, just then, when Jesus died, those were his followers and a few other women as well. Not much to go on, not much of a start. But we know, we have faith. We know that the church grew from these very unpromising beginnings. One of the things that we're getting here from these women is faith, faith, faith. Without faith, no progress. Let's have faith. All the best.